Welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast, bringing you the stories of many people who in various ways are attempting to walk the path of yoga. Our intention is to inspire your own practice and commitment to yoga beyond the mat and in all areas of life. We consider this an offering, a service to the community and labour of love. If you feel inclined, any donations are appreciated. Just visit our page and click the donate button at www.keenonyoga.co.uk/podcast. I hope you enjoy the show. Today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Liz Koch. Liz never planned anything to do with the yoga world. Rather, she worked as a teacher of sculpture in the university in the US for many years, until they happened to involve someone in their program to teach yoga for the first thing in the mornings as a kind of warm-up. So it was from here she started to understand there was something missing in the way most people connected to their bodies, as well as how they were taught to. And this was a deeper understanding of how to connect to the core, mediated by her understanding of the psoas. So from here, Liz was asked to start writing. I don't know how that came about, for the Yoga Journal. And these articles ended up turning into a book called Awareness. And this was really the first serious discussion of the psoas. And it was published in the 90s when hardly anyone had ever heard of this muscle. More recently, Liz released her second book, Stalking Wild Psoas, as an answer to it in a greater degree to the mistaken aspects of application regarding her first book. Because she does not believe in labelling and defining the body as something to be known or indeed stretched. Instead, she treats the body as a living entity. So you work with the psoas from the inside out. It can only be experienced by the individual. It can't be known. To which end, in this first episode, because we'll do a second shortly, she discusses how you can't stretch the psoas out. Rather, you can nurture the psoas. So you're doing the whole thing from the inside out. And very interestingly, in this inside-out approach, she brings into the frame of discourse a post-colonial theory and notions of patriarchy or against patriarchy, and resisting our inherent inclination to control and legislate to know. So instead of that, we're trying to experience. That is, to facilitate our own expression of what it means to have a healthy psoas, as opposed to someone else's. Inevitably, this is an involved discussion, so this is part one, and we shall be recording another follow-up very soon with Liz. It's a fantastic discussion episode, so I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Liz, to the Keen on Yoga podcast. Really happy to have you here.
So today's guest is Liz Koch, and really pleased to have you after reading your book many years ago. I'm really pleased to meet you in person as we are now, Liz. So welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and for as I was discussing with Liz before, for our Ashtangi viewers, listeners, you probably don't know who Liz is, so I just like to give this opportunity for Liz to just describe your background. And I don't know whether you were ever into yoga or how you got to be interested in the psoas or an expert in the psoas. What was your background to writing that book I read on the psoas?
Yeah, so you're talking about the psoas book that was written.
Awareness, the psoas.
The first book is from the 1980s.
Oh God! Right.
Yeah, it's called the psoas. It's called the psoas.
Right. I need an update. Right, so we'll move on to the later book, which sounds really interesting later.
And core awareness was the next one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And that was called Enhancing Yoga, Pilates Exercise and Dance. I'm a conceptual artist, and I worked at the Boston Museum School of Fine Arts. And so I came into movement through understanding that it changes our perception. So I'm actually interested in perception and consciousness. And so my work was based on that. But when I entered a class with Bob Cooley, who wrote a beautiful book called The Genius of Flexibility, he was focused, and he was a dancer. So he came out of the dance background. He was focused on the psoas when I met him. And why I went to find somebody was that I had some experience. And actually, it was the pigeon pose that changed my perception. So I just have to say, I did do a tiny bit of play in the yoga world. But anyways, I had this realization that movement changes perception. Like, you start to feel different, you see the world different. And so I was like curious. I wanted more because my own body was very rigid at the time, even though I was very expansive in my thinking. And I was teaching flexible sculpture, which meant I was in an all-male sculpture department that looked at body as form, looked at shape, looked at sculpture as solid, rock and cement and wood. And I was bringing in all kinds of ways of working that were more playful and soft, materials and spaces rather than shapes. So that's my background. And what happened was in 1990, it was 1999 before there was internet, Yoga Journal reached out to me. Actually, one of the editors had taken a workshop and asked me to write. And so I entered the yoga world, not because I'm a yogi, but because I had something to offer the community that would maybe support their explorations or their asanas.
Right. And that was through the flexible sculpture, or that was pre-Psoas. So how did the flexible sculpture, I've been very intrigued by the idea of flexible sculpture, or the sculpture of the empty shape rather than the kind of form and the full shape. How did that kind of transpire into the Psoas? Or was that the guy that you were working with that you found?
No, what happened was I continued doing flexible sculpture. I moved out to California at one point, worked up at one of the universities. But what I was really realizing I was doing was I was playing with me. I became the sculptor. I became the what happens when I change my tissue? What happens when I change my form? How does that change what I see in the world or how I perceive myself or the world? So it became kind of at a certain point where Anna Halprin, who is was a dancer and a conceptual artist as well, her work influenced mine in the sense that she looked at life and dance more as a score, not something you perform. It's not performative. So I don't think of yoga as performative, and yet it is today. And I wasn't, for the most part, because it went into the exercise world, right? And it went into the fitness world. And, years ago, you had to join, a group.
Yeah, no one was really looking at what you were doing. It was,
spiritual world. And now it's performative in the sense of, you go to yoga class and you do these movements and you feel better. So then how do they combine? And sculpture was the same way. And, dance is the same way. So it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And so I became more curious about how you do it. And I wrote that core awareness book because I wanted people to understand the very core of their being, not as something to recruit so that they could look like they were in the asana, but to actually embody and download that, generational, thousands of years deep knowledge through our own tissue.
And the core of the being Psoas. How was that from your experience that you started working with your Psoas? Or
well, no. What happened was when I started playing, when I started attending a class of movement, and really what Bob was doing was he was in the early stages of somatic, what we call now somatic movement or embodiment. In other words, at that time it was called human potential. There were human potential classes in which you entered into a sensory, you entered into, we need it right now, into a sensory experience of yourself and tracked your sensation and the relationship it has to emotion and to thoughts. And so the sensory world was where he was. And he was spending a lot of time on the floor in constructive rest, which is a great way of kind of locating your psoas. But also, I wasn't looking for my psoas per se. But as I stayed there, I started to notice that I kept jumping out of the position. And finally, I caught the fact that I was terrified, literally terrified. And so I started to notice my own nervous system. And I found that fascinating that as a human being, I'm not my nervous system. My consciousness can watch my own nervous system. I can observe my own nervous system. So I'm not my nervous system. Then, so what am I? Who am I? And that kind of started the journey. Also, I had a lot of pain. I had a lot of stricture in my body. And I didn't even think about that. It was something I didn't have to live with. It was just entering that conversation of like, that's not normal. But I have a history of scoliosis. And so, I didn't know I could change all of that. And so it also entered all of that conversation. But I've never been in the physical therapy world. I teach physical therapists. I give CEU credits to body workers. But I'm not in any of those worlds, which makes my work kind of unique because I'm not trying to fix anybody. I'm not trying to solve a problem.
You must have had some experience with the psoas. What was your experience? Yeah.
45.
You write very eloquently about it. What were your experiences of it? And for someone that doesn't have any understanding of the psoas, how would you explain it? We're assuming that people know what we're talking about because it is a kind of word that's thrown around in the yoga world these days quite a lot. People get confused with there's a whole bunch of muscles down there, right? Like we've got the iliacus, the piriformis, the psoas, being the kind of main muscles that link your legs basically to your trunk, right? Like what's so special about the psoas, and what was your kind of moment where you thought, well, this is something deeper than my nervous system, which is essentially what you interestingly were saying there, right?
Yes. So what I came to was that, and in the psoas book, I started approaching psoas. My students asked me to write it. It was a little manual, and then it became a book. And then it became it kept traveling. It had a life of its own. And what I was starting out with was biomechanics, because anybody who kind of says, where is this muscle, is going to Google or open up an anatomy book and start looking for this. And I did the same thing. But as I kept exploring my own terrain, my own organism, it didn't make sense that it was something you recruited. It was a stabilizer. It was a hip flexor. It's like, that's not my experience of psoas. And I started talking about that. And over time, as I got more confident that I was experiencing something very different, I also read a book called The Hara. And so I became very aware of the energetic field of body and also posture. What posture demonstrates? What are we suggesting when we're in a particular posture? And so it was much more complex than looking at, this is this thing. Eventually, I was introduced to embryology. And embryology is a different paradigm than biomechanics. And all of a sudden, I said, oh my God, this is what I'm talking about. I'm in embryology. I'm experiencing embryological primal expression. I am.
What's embryology?
Embryology is the development of the human being. So biomechanics is looking at dead tissue. You're looking at dead. What is dead? You're objectifying the body. You're cutting it open. You're putting it in boxes. It's called reductionist thinking. We're looking at, all this tissue goes in the muscle box. All this tissue goes in the bone box. All this tissue goes in the nerve box. And psoas was put in the muscle box. But I don't think it's a muscle. And now that we're studying connective tissue, lo and behold, we can start to understand that the qualities of being are very fluid, that if you take space away from the organism, you're 90% water, or some level of fluid, whether that's blood or tears or sweat, or, and that we're not made up of we're made up of a matrix that is literally not carrying fluid, is fluid. Psoas is the juiciest tissue at the very core. It is the filet mignon. It is the tenderloin, and if you're a vegetarian, think of it as a peeled cucumber. Okay, it's the juiciness. It's orbital. It's as big as your fist. And it's dynamic, it's expressive. It's not something you lock down. It's something you allow to flourish. So it changed the model, the paradigm of body as object to body as process. Because in embryology, you are the embryo forever. The embryo is like the seed. It's still unfolding. You are still, as an organism, unfolding. Your cells are a momentary aspect of a metabolic or energetic process. You are not a thing. And so as long as we use the construct of I'm a thing, I'm going to fix this thing, you can't understand psoas. You have to actually remember what it is to be a living organism, to be a living river. Your core is more like a living river than it is a column.
All right, so you can't actually know it as such because that would be to close it down, right? So in which case, how do you make the effort to embody it?
Well, you are it. It's part of you. So the way I describe psoas now is that psoas is a messenger of your central nervous system, or what in embryology is called your midline. So what the big change is here, and I think it's really appropriate in the yoga world, is that rather than look at ourselves as a column, the spinal column, when you're using that model, all tissue from the spine forward flexes, all tissue from the spine back extends. Okay, there is no being. There's no soul. There's no, you're just an object. Okay, but if you look at embryology, first and foremost, when the cells begin to divide and multiply for you to unfold into the world, you are circulating around an axis. The axis of your own being connected to the axis of your mother's being, connected to the Earth's axis, to the cosmos. Okay? And all of a sudden, you are in touch with a bio-intelligence in which you are being both returning to and being shaped by. And that core in embryology, this is science, okay, is where we emerge from. So now, if you look at it from a physics point of view, you're kind of more like a donut. You actually have a field of energy within you. It's called an orbital field, the axis mundi. It's the Chinese medicine. It's the governing vessel. It's the conception vessel. I mean, it's called all different things in different traditions. But we're talking about, and in Taoist healing, psoas is called the muscle of the soul. So now we're not manipulating the psoas. We're not trying to control it. We're not trying to get it to do what we want. We're actually listening to its messages. And we're not recruiting it. So we're not misusing it, overusing it, or abusing it. This tissue is very, when you're tuned into a healthy psoas, it's very fluid and almost like touching a cloud or something with your awareness. Like you can't really, get a hold of it. So if you've got one of those psoases that you go, I can really feel it, you're misusing it.
And this, you said, was kind of touched on in your latest book, which is the idea of the kind of colonial kind of perspective on bodywork, right? Or would it be a patriarchal colonial idea about kind of objectifying and quantifying something and kind of holding on to it as rather than kind of letting something expand naturally into space. I don't know whether I put that in the right way, but it seems nebulous though. How would one start to work on something which is just a messenger apart from just allowing the space? Is that literally what one does? Lie down? And I think you do actually talk. I think that was the first time I tried the Constructive Rest from your book, with the belt around the knees on a practical level, right? And just allowing that release there. Is that?
Yeah, and in my books, you'll never see a belt around the knees. And so people use Constructive Rest in yoga a lot, and they refer to my book, but they use different images. So the reason why, here's the reason why, is that yes, you could use a belt, and that would help you kind of locate where your legs are, right? And for a lot of people, because their legs fall out, it would give them a sense of where the muscular tension they're holding. But that's not what gets you into psoas. What gets you into psoas is your bones. And so weight is better than belts, because what we want is good proprioception. And proprioception, and specifically skeletal perception, is an internal sense of landing and locating. So think of wild animal body. If the animal can't locate on the earth, they can't feel their bones on the earth, they're in jeopardy of being eaten. They can't feel and sense what's happening in the environment they're in. In the colonized, objectified body, you don't have a space and time. You simply have a body. It's moving through a landscape. Nothing is alive. You are not an animal. You are an object. So as long as you move mechanistically through space, you're good to go. But we're not. We're a living organism. We're part of an ecosystem. We're responding much deeper. So when you can sense your bones, so let's use constructive rest in a very practical way. If you get into constructive rest, which is on your back, knees up, feet on the floor, aligning your feet parallel to each other. And at this point, I often just say, if you're not sure where your feet go in relationship to your butt, like how close to your butt, you're not looking at abdominals. You want to be able to feel your whole foot on the ground. But say when you're there, all you feel is this tension in your legs and it wants to fall in or fall out. Then put little sandbags on your feet. Start to feel ground, start to land. Or on your knees, just something small on your knees that gives you a sense of connection between joints. It's in the joints where we find location, literal location, not only range of motion, but location, ecolocation on the earth.
There's also, I think it's incredibly difficult for people in this day and age because obviously the colonial perspective and the kind of masculine patriarchal idea is a process towards an aim, particular aim being something rather than just being.
Yes.
And, I think
there you go.
The most incredibly difficult posture for people in yoga class is at the end when they have to lie down and maybe stay there for 10 minutes. I suppose when you're really referring to constructive rest as it seems like the primary technique to get into this feeling, and you refer in your new title to Stalking the Wild, and it is coming back to, like I said, like a rewilding idea, to use a currently popular term, right?
Yes.
It's coming back to oneself without any construct around it. Someone saying, well, you have to be like this, and this is where you're going with your yoga, and this is where your aim or your motivation should lie. Can we close down this and define any more around a process of what you should or shouldn't be feeling towards this goal? Because people will go out and try this after listening to this, right? And so they want to, there's some kind of quantifiers around it. Am I just wasting my time sitting here with two beanbags on my feet? I just feel like I want to look at my phone,
Well, that's your nervous system. Okay, so your nervous system is entrained, right? And you're now entrained with the phone. And so what happens in constructive rest as a starting point? And I would use it maybe for 3 minutes before you begin yoga practice. Okay, as a way of landing in your bones so that you're moving from a kind of intelligence that's coming from, it's going to shape you. It's going to emerge out of you. You're not going in and taking something, which is the colonization, right? It's I'm going to take this because this is meaningful to me and I can use this and I can benefit from it and I can, it's mine now.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's not what you are. You're a living organism. So actually turning your cortex, your neocortex, towards your primal animal body starts to create a intelligence or a nourishing that, literally your kidneys ride on your psoas. They float on. So if you want to one of the reasons you're here on Earth is to actually flourish, to actually, why are you doing this? What are you trying to recruit? What are you trying to gain? Isn't it survival? Isn't it, to be able to create something or to bring your gift to the world? You can see how we've used it as consumerism. It's now we're going in and we're going to, get this thing.
Now we just want information on the psoas from you, Liz, and we want, please teach us how to get that. And make the most of it for at least for our social media. If
that's the performative piece. There it is.
If nothing else. So what kind of feedback should we be expecting if we're kind of doing it? Is there any right or wrong, or should we just be wait and watch and listen? and make our own minds up.
Curiosity is always a good sign, because if you're a little bit curious, you're not in your sympathetic fight or flight response. So let's look at survival as maybe one of the things we hope to gain from, like, health, like the ability to feel healthier, or to feel more at ease, or to feel more confident, or to feel less vulnerable. Vulnerability is a really good place to look at, because for most people, they don't want to feel vulnerable, right? We want to feel safe. Well, so as messages, whether you're safe or not. That is its main, in a simple way of thinking about it. Am I safe? Am I not safe? And when I first got into Constructive Rest and I started playing there, and I would find myself jumping up, and at that time, there was no phone that I carried around. It was in another room, and people actually knocked on your door, and things like that. And yeah, really. Busy. And I would swear the phone rang or somebody was knocking at my door, and then finally I said, neither of these things what is happening? So I tried to catch the moment, and I realized what I was experiencing was fear. Okay, and so I became curious, and I turned towards that, and rather than kind of anxiety in which I just got to do something, I just got to move. I started to kind of stay there with it and just see what else showed up. So that made me very curious. But what it also did is it gave gravity enough time to let down the extraneous excitation that I was holding in the very core of my being. Meaning that I wasn't trying to release my psoas, like do something, but it was gravity was changing my psoas, because animal body Liz, was literally landing on the ground. I was finally here. I had arrived on Earth. And we have to realize that so many of us have birth trauma, partly because of the mechanistic model of birth for the last generations, in which you don't arrive hearing birds singing and smelling flowers. You arrive in a clinical, sterile environment, and you're supposed to relate to the earth. How does that work out? Yeah.
Or you can schedule it in.
Or schedule it in. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And then you're carried around in a plastic container, like you don't touch Earth. You don't actually, as an infant, connect to Earth. So you're not what's called in the nervous system. You're not co-regulated. Mammals co-regulate. Our culture, the Western culture, modernity, sees body as individualized, and the way you individualize the body is to isolate. It's actually a form of torture, just to kind of put it in perspective. You're actually, so you sleep train your baby. You don't, you're trying to individuate it by making it do something on its own. But actually, as a mammal, we co-regulate, which means body is really important. Another body, I always think of mama bears when they watch their little baby bear climbing a tree or doing something, beyond being on body. You're looking at, all of a sudden, the organism starts to flail. Maybe the branch breaks or it gets afraid. And she lumbers over, grabs baby, and puts it to her body. What is she doing? Well, we think of it as soothing, but what she's actually doing is regulating that nervous system so it can gain the access that it needs to be able to self-regulate. And if we get all the way to self-regulation, then we're able to be a parent to another animal, but most of us aren't, and yet we still reproduce. So so we're looking at our own unmature nervous system, which we want to then do a top-down control. Well, then I just need to recruit more muscle density, and that will make me feel safe. But actually, it's in the bones, it's in the landing, it's in the nourishment of the nervous system, and that's what psoas is talking about.
It's also not, again, going back to the idea that it's not a reductionist kind of paradigm where we're labeling parts of our body as if we can know it by looking at, okay, that does that and that does that. We are actually the thing, but it's like you can't look at it. You are the psoas, right? So how could looking at trying to.
It's called your neural core. It's literally in the deepest part of your connective tissue. And so I don't look at cadavers, but when they're studying fluid cadavers now, studying connective tissue, that the scientists tell me when we're looking, we see these kind of like the way the connective tissue forms almost a bag. And inside that bag is, an organ floating, or muscle sliding, and in the deepest core of your being is your central nervous system, your psoas, your kidneys, and your adrenals. So no one can fix that. If you poke the psoas, it's like poking a caterpillar. You can keep manipulating, you can trigger point it, you can have somebody go in there and try to fix it. You can't be fixed. You have to flourish. You can't make a flower blossom by pulling it apart. It's like what would nourish that ability for the organism to really fully show up. That creates safety. That creates coherency, is what it's called.
Two questions come to mind. One, a burning question out of curiosity. Once you kind of found the sense of, you must have had some experience with the psoas, right? Like, was it revelatory to you? And did you suddenly become really good at yoga?
Well, I've never practiced.
Did you become very sexy all of a sudden?
I mean, it's not to say I've never been in it. But let's use that as an example of what creates better psoas. So really what you're looking at is, well, how could I have the healthiest, most fluid, juicy psoas? Okay? Because that's going to really bring me into coherency in everything I do in my life. Okay? Whether that's you're looking at balance, or you're looking at endurance, or you're looking at resiliency. So it changes the idea of density as strength to resiliency as strength. And we all know water is pretty powerful. You can move mountains, right? And buildings. And, anything we think is a construct. So the more fluid my tissue is. So how do I get hydrated psoas? And in yoga, we can't get hydrated psoas. We actually have to get hydrated psoas to do yoga. So let's turn it around and use the pigeon pose as the example. Any kind of lunge that people think is going to stretch their psoas or make it healthier.
Pigeon. This is. Why are you doing that? I was stretching my psoas. How many times have I heard that?
Yes, and
I did recently read that in your stuff, actually.
So this is a beautiful example. To do a lunge, you have to have a healthy psoas. Otherwise, what you're actually doing is destabilizing ligaments. Because if your psoas is tight, you can't stretch it. We have to change the paradigm from thinking of psoas as muscle to thinking of it as almost like an organ of perception. It's like you can't make it do something. You have to kind of nourish it, and your tongue, although it has fibers that we call muscular, we don't think of the tongue as something muscular. We think of it as something we taste with, we speak with.
It's kind of a very sensitive pet.
Yes. So there you go. So what we're looking at when we're turning towards the psoas is what would create more, rather than think of psoas as tense or tight or short, think of it as exhausted and dry. Once we turn that around, and now we know we're using our psoas to try to find safety, but recruiting it actually creates more a lack of safety, because in the ultimate way, you can't create strength through density. It has to be through the fluid system. The fluid is the communication of life through our organism. So when we shut it out, we dry up. So a lot of psoases are dry. And that means it shrinks. So it's not short, it's shrinking. So pulling on tissue that's dry and is not making it healthier. It's more likely you're going to tear something else. You're going to injure something else, which is why pigeon has kind of been taken off the table a lot in beginning yoga, is because people injure themselves, right? So we're looking at, well, how do we not injure ourselves? So you have to do some fluid. And that could be things connected to connective tissue. It could be things with, I just use balls, like an inflatable ball I work with. You can simply stand in your shower, wrap your arms around you, and connect, let the water run down your spine. And as you do, try to find a relationship between your tail and your tongue. See if the two will move at the same time. So you're returning to primal movement. So you do primal movement to be more functional in yoga.
That's hydrating. So it's not actually literal hydrating, or do we need to actually think about what we eat as well?
Well, yes, what you eat and drink is important. But think about it. If you drink tons of water and you're dry, it's like the dry sponge. The sponge, it won't go in. It won't go in. It won't be absorbed. Yeah. So I talk about metabolizing. Yeah. We have to metabolize. These kind of restorative gestures support what we love doing. So if you're not finding it in yoga, you do it as an adjunct to support. That's why I call it enhancing yoga. Core awareness enhances yoga, Pilates, exercise, and dance. It doesn't fix it.
How do you do, for someone who's reluctant to kind of do these natural movements? We have this thing called, five rhythms in England. I'm not in England now, but you've heard of it, right? And you dance, and the people invited me so many times to come to the five rhythms. But I'm a guy, and I'm a certain kind of guy, I suppose, and I'm kind of reluctant to. I'm a bit uptight, I suppose. I do kind of find it difficult to let go, as well, many people do, not just guys, and do those natural fluid movements. And I'm a rubbish salsa dancer, and I don't have any sway. How could I start?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you look at the bodies of indigenous men, and they have movement through their spine. Pelvises that move. They're grounded on the earth. You look at the white colonized Western man, they have a column, they have floors, like we talk about pelvic floors. God, I hope I never have a pelvic floor. Like, I have no floors. I have no column. I'm not a building, I have diaphragms and they move. And I like to move more like a jellyfish or an octopus, that has that like literal tissue of life in it. And we look at that colonized. And so I've actually written articles about the colonization, or what's called the idealized white body. And Resmaa Menakem, who wrote a beautiful book on racism and somatic racism, My Grandmother's Hands, when he and I met, I started
somatic racism.
We're looking at a structure through what's called modernity. In the indigenous cultures, this whole concept of conquering. So you come out of a lineage of conquering, of whether you like it or not, that's your ancestry. Okay, so now you're saying, how do I interface with life?
Conquering and then reducing and isolating parts.
Yeah, and now you're saying, how do I do this? I don't know, I can just go to a 5-rhythm class and find this and not feel like an idiot or a fool. How do I start to feel that? And I think you see that in some of the traditions of people going back to ancestral movement or animal movements, where we start playing. Remember being a kid and climbing a tree and, rolling down the hill and curling and arcing and playing like you're different animals and you're on the ground. Kind of everybody needs to do children's yoga, like when you turn into different animals, like thinking of body as animal. Something like cat and cow. You are working with the spine at that point, but you're not doing it mechanically. You start to feel the expression of life that comes through you.
Oh, that's deep. It's just revelation, isn't it? To look at and to consider the body that way, because then it's just a completely different view of the whole of the process of life. I.e., it's not a process with a particular end in mind. It was like, I don't know whether you've read any Michel Foucault, but, he talks about one example of going to there's a film crew that goes to this remote village in somewhere, I shan't say exactly where, but they're quite untouched by the Western world, for example. And they say to the villagers, well, what did you think about the film and the plot? And they said, and then the thing they were most interested in was the play of the light through the trees. On the characters, right? Not like the drama and the action and such, but it's just a completely different way of looking at things.
Yes,
what
you're talking
about suggesting
feel.
It's
you're talking about inclusion of feel. Rupert Sheldrake did a really good video last year during COVID on this mechanistic world that we're living in, and what happened. Like, how did it change? How did we get here from being more related to organic responses? How did this? And he helps kind of as a biologist, but he's been really criticized because as a biologist, he kept looking at the field. And in biology, you look at the thing, you look at the cell. You don't look at what the cell is growing in. What is influencing the cell. And in embryology, it's the same thing. The embryo. So we're having a storm, and all of a sudden there's thunder. Embryo. As we come into being, the embryologist, Jaap van der Walt, speaks of, you are not constructed. You are not made up of cells. You utilize cells to become. And when we start understanding that, the field of influence, the field of life, starts to touch us on deep, profound levels. We're being moved. We don't move. So what we're doing, to me, right now, is having a conversation around how do we decolonize the very core of our own being? Because we trained the right?
Yeah, somatic deconstructionism, really, isn't it? I mean, just kind of looking at things without a context. Let's say, this is a pre-given context that you're going to see your own body in, that you're going to move in it and understand your own nature in. And, and this is not what I was expecting in the talk with you at all. All I was expecting to learn about the psoas, and how to fix that problem.
That's what the psoas tells us.
I have a problem and I want an answer,
Well, we can talk about that. We can
try and make some money off that then. After that.
Exactly. How can we make a profit from this?
Yeah, exactly. How do I turn a profit on the psoas?
Yeah. And so I would say work on the ankle. If you want to help other people's psoases, work on their ankle. Learn to define ankle glide, because when you can get into your joints, if you can sense your bones, your psoas has nothing to say. It's just fine. Now, if you've been dry, you're going to have to do some little hydrating movements to kind of come out of that dryness. So like when you're talking about my spine doesn't feel like it does those movements, you can regain lateral fissure, because really if you track the bone, it goes back, it evolved out of the ocean. So the earliest vertebrae is a sea squirt. And so we're looking at science here. We're not making up a story in terms of we're recognizing that we've been in a story, and now how do I bring this awareness into the things that I love, including survival and supporting my family and being functional. I'm doing pretty well, and I've made a life of psoas. But my intention was never to do that. People kept wanting to know about this thing. And as I kept meeting more and more people around the world, I've been doing this for 45 years. I've met a lot of people, including a surgeon from Serbia who contacted me during COVID and said, I want to talk about psoas. And I go, I'm not in the physical health world. And he said, I don't care. I want you to know that when I'm doing surgeries on people who've injured their spines, I'm in there and I'm seeing dry psoas. And I go, yes. And he's like, I can't do anything for that. Like, I don't, that's not my expertise. And I said, and he said, but I'm starting to find how the Doppler can figure it. And I said, I can look at people and see their psoas. I don't need to cut them open. I can just look at them. And actually, when you hydrate your psoas, you often restore your central nervous system, your spine, the actual vertebrae of your spine. So bone is fluid also. It breathes. So you can see if I change the concept, if I change the paradigm, all of a sudden, I'm going to be looking at what brings restorative movement. What brings, and in core awareness, one of the models is Derek Stockton, who's a power lifter. And so he's a 5'9" man, 180 pounds in his 40s when he was doing powerlifting. And he could lift 4 times his own body weight. That man has a very free spine and a juicy psoas. And the reason he said is because when you put that much weight, 800 pounds of steel on my shoulders, everything has to pour down through the skeletal system. That's the only place that can support that much weight. My organs will, explode. My tissue will tear. But if I can get everything to move through the bones, because bones can handle gravity, right? They have the most density and the most resiliency because they have ground force reaction. They have rebound. And that's what brings me up when I'm doing a squat with that much on my body. But my psoas has to be incredibly juicy because I have to be able to read the skeletal system with no interruption. And if that tissue is dense in some way or interrupting neurological communication, I can't locate. I can't, I'll kind of tweak it or I'll move it and then I'll injure myself. And I watched him injure himself in a meet. I didn't watch it at the meet, but I saw him after the meet. And he said, I tried to shift my weight a tiny bit, which you're not supposed to do. But he said, I thought I could kind of shift something and gain that. And he said, and I tore my SI joints, your sacroiliac joints, which happens for a lot of people. And, most people, it takes years to heal their SI joints. This man, because of his fluid tissue, and he has the most hydrated fluid tissue I've ever seen, he can contract every quad till it's hard like a rock, and within less than 30 seconds, let go of it, it turns into a bowl full of jelly. I mean, so it's resiliency in tissue. And he said, I was in bed the next day, I couldn't walk. I had psoas pain. I was like, I was in a lot of pain. But within 2 weeks, he was fine because he had resiliency. So restoration, think of a river that's dry. Restoration is about how do we do these gestures that support us, that then can be taken into life and anything that's happening to us in life.
I suppose I'm always thinking when you're talking about this guy, what does his emotional terrain look like? It must be, and now particularly more recently, we're talking a lot about trauma in yoga, and surely there's like we were talking about the mother bear, the idea of feeling safe. People that have trauma, and we all have trauma to degrees, but people that have perhaps more trauma, are they likely to have a dry psoas? And in which case, if you're going back in there, if you consciously try to go back in there and hydrate that, it was at the point that the trauma might all come out.
I have to speak to your language. To go back in there implies that you are not your body.
Sorry.
That's okay. Right?
Yeah.
I'm using it, Adam, because I think it's a really beautiful
kind of
way of rethinking
terminology.
Right? You don't have to apologize. Think about that. Like, that is what we think. We have to go inside. We have to embody. Embodiment has become also colonized, right? I'm going to embody myself. We're now going to pierce, and gain and utilize, this thing. It's insidious. I'm still, working with language. Like it's incredible how our language keeps objectifying ourselves, right? Like, where are you if you're not body? If you're not your own tissue, if you're not your own cells, if you're not still unfolding, like the embryologist says, you utilize cells to become, then you're infused in all tissue, your awareness of you. So what you're looking at is then the level of trauma of what we call disassociation. And that's part of what happened to us as infants being not co-regulated. So you're right. Not only are there individual hard traumas of, accidents and injuries and whatever, emotional abuse, physical, all the different levels of trauma. And then there's what's called soft trauma, which is growing in. So growing in poverty, growing in, a war zone, being raised in a refugee camp, the actual environment. But you could almost say colonization is a form of trauma. That it actually isn't bringing us into more coherency. And now, as a species, we are the only species who destroys every other species, including ourselves. We are in a moment of reckoning, and here we are. And so, again, we can't use the same strategy that got us into the problem. So we have to begin to understand what would bring rhythm. Think of rhythm as one of the ways to find coherence, right? And that different rhythms. So that means instead of having a sympathetic response of I'm going for this, that's a movement we use to get to safety. But then we go into rhythms. That means slowing down, lightening up, and allowing the biology, the literal movement of our fluids and tissue to move us. This is a slowing down, it's a pausing, it's looking for micro movements. It's not a fix-it model. And yet it creates a really deep capacity. So let's use vulnerability, going back to that, because that's upper psoas. Okay.
It just seems that there's no possibility with this kind of holistic perspective to get out of this double bind. It's like, you know, if you're emotionally closed down, your psoas is going to be dry, and then in which case that will affect your emotions, and you know, you're in this kind of catch-22 situation. And the other thing that came to mind, there's so many things what you're saying is this fantastic. I think this is an amazing topic. Is that, have you ever seen the Tibetans use different sounds?
Yes,
they use different sound vibrations.
Yes, so sound and making sound and finding rhythm, like a little rock, like say, let's use cat and cow type of idea of being on your hands and knees and you're moving from tail to tongue. What if you were not just doing it mechanistically, but you were allowing little movements to restore that river, to bring back that meandering, that ability for the spine to move more like a caterpillar than be. Those little gestures will change everything. It's like you're taking your system out of freeze. And what we're looking at when we're looking at disassociation, so what we think of, you know, what's being talked about in the yoga community of bypass. You know, if I just meditate, you know, that's actually a very masculine energy to meditate, because it's really beautiful. If you think about it from the animal body, that's the ability to come into the field in a way that you are able to be so quiet that you can see the deer that you were about to spear. It's a hunting technique. It's an animal hunting technique. That's not what women do. They go into a larger field. The feminine energy goes into that field and holds the capacity for it. In some ways, it's a similar, but it's a very internal rather than external energy. We have both. We want both. It's not one or the other. So you're looking at, how do I start to feel into this capacity of my own system to restore? Because that's the trick. In my work, rather than try to do it right, I look at what is interrupting an organism that knows how to self-heal, self-organize, self-right itself, to be competent as an animal body. What is interrupting? And it can be something very simple. It doesn't have to be this big thing like I need to, and I don't believe in discharging as a way of actually solving trauma. Trauma is, what the word means is overwhelm of the nervous system. And so what we're looking at is what will allow me to metabolize? And going back to like the water piece, you know, you can drink all that water, but if you're a dry sponge, nothing happens. But the little bit of moving the sponge, right? Just even making those wave motions. Think of the tide. Think of, you know, those kind of like any fluid movement, a little wave, a little rock, a little undulation, a little spiral. I mean, micro movements we're talking. We're not even talking big dance movements. All right. All of a sudden, the tissue starts to open back up. So you're opening up connective tissue. And when you open up connective tissue, you take people out of nerve pain, but you also allow them to metabolize their experiences when they are in a place of safety. Okay, so being on the ground, you know, is one of the ways we find safety. That's Mama Bear. The now Mama Bear is the earth. You get on the earth. You literally put your belly to the earth. You literally get in constructive rest on the earth. If you really have no earth to get on, then you get on the floor, you know, of your, on the 34th
condo.
floor
apartment.
You know? But you put your arms around a tree. We have to actually co-regulate with the earth now. You know, and most people will say that, boy, when I take a walk, you know, in the woods, or I'm sitting by a river, I feel like a restorative, you know, I start feeling restored. And certainly, you know, you take people to to islands and to, places where restoration is what you're getting in the movement of the water and in the breathing of the air and the food. And you're creating the environment that holds the restorative capacity. So you can't just go for it. You have to create a container for the restorative space. And that's what you do when you do a retreat, right? You used to.
Are you advising any other level apart from the physical? Do you talk about emotions or better and worse foods? Or, probably it's obvious, right? Get enough sleep and don't eat bad food and,
yes, because right. Your cells are breathing. And, if you eat foods that have plastics, like are fake, are synthetic.
And a lot of foods do actually have plastics in them.
And now they have plastics in them. Well, babies are born with plastic in their brain. So, I don't even think I could go there. But the ability for the system, think of metabolizing is longing. That's the emotion. How about that? My first longing is to show up here on Earth. And when the cell divides, part of your cell embeds into your mother's womb. That is a going out and rooting into the earth. Your mother's womb is the rooting into her. That is your first longing. Your intestines, your philia go out and they long for what you need. They take what you need. You can eat the best food and it can go right through you. So if your philia isn't responsive, then longing is about the heart and what do I really long for? And so many of us have stopped longing. That's kind of the drying. We're a freeze, right? It's like we're in shock. Some of us have longed and then a baby who cries and no one picks it up. That is a level of deep, profound, just heart-rendering. And what does that pain that baby feels internally when there is no call and response to being here is natural opiates are released. And the natural opiates basically are the same as the fox caught in a trap who chews its own leg off. It's the ability for the system to not feel pain when it's being destroyed. So when we have natural opiates, it also makes us, the United States is full of opiate addiction. There is such a deep longing to belong, to find kinship, to find earth, to show up here, to really actually bring our gifts. And I think that the model of emotions has to be switched from the Western view, which is a kind of Maslow concept that was the pyramid concept that, you are born and you're a blank slate, and now you're going to learn all these things and you're going to mature and then you're going to become an individual. But in the indigenous cultures, it's the other way around. You are a unique soul who has entered this earth, and we are here to hold space for you to become fully you, to flourish, to thrive, to fully bring your gift, because that's what you're here for, is to bring your gift into the world. And how can we hold space for that to show?
Also, I thought you were going to say it's a model of individuality where you're not seeking to individuate, you're seeking to connect yourself. It seems like the psoas itself is not a problem to be solved at all, but it's certainly not a problem to be solved. I've got that now. The problem to be solved not as an individual either. The language even of the individual is
there
perhaps,
is a global psoas. Yes, I feel like there is
the idea that the psoas is a collective endeavor.
It's a species endeavor. It's about coherency as a species. It's primal. It's part of, in terms of science and the way we break up the brain, it's the reptilian brain. It's the primal brain. And most of us are terrified of the primal brain. We've been taught that that's savage, that's like you don't want to be an animal. I firmly believe psoas is really, you can't, it's part of the autonomic nervous system. You can't control it. You can try, you can strangle it, you can use it, you can manipulate, but what you're doing emotionally, and these are strategies you learned as a young child, was, if you tell a young kid, stop crying, stop crying now. And, and I've heard dads say that to their sons, right? In an airport, I saw this dad, like he was getting so unregulated. He didn't know what to do with this crying kid on his, and his, he says, stop crying. What does that child possibly do? One, he's starting to feel his own father unable to regulate. Then he's like, I don't know what he's crying about, but nevertheless, he's upset about something. And the two of them are both, I felt like I needed to be the mama bear and go hold both of them, It's like, okay, can we all get on the floor here?
Do some small movements with your ankles and your hands.
Yeah, there you go. You could have started humming, and rocking the child, instead of walking across going, I don't know what to do with you. I'll put you in a trash can, It's like we have to. So yes, we regulate each other. But that's different than codependence. And I really want to differentiate that coherency is not codependence. What to me you want ultimately is to be really connected, to really feel belonging and be free. And so that's what we also see in communities in which somebody's holding space and they become, it happens in the bodywork world too. Someone starts controlling the container.
That's exactly it, isn't it? You want context, you want belonging, but you want freedom. And I mean, generally we see one or the other. You've got belonging, but you're pretty much constricted in terms of how society is going to tell you are and to be. And more. I think we've got the both going on. Because we've got great individuation as well, but no one can give you any kind of contextualization of yourself. You can be whatever you want, whenever you want, at any moment, right? Right.
We're not rooted. We're not part of the earth. They call it the hungry ghost. And part of it's an ancestral story. So
to try and get Galamati on the podcast, but he hasn't.
Yes. Well, his new movie, the people who created the movie, I can't remember who they are, but it's called the Wisdom of Trauma. It is a beautifully well done movie, and it is about his work in his life. And one of the things he brings into the trauma piece, and there's wonderful people working in the trauma world, but one of the pieces he brings in that's, I feel, so essential is this idea that it's not just what happened to you, it's what didn't happen. And he does speak about being a baby who, his mother only fed him every 4 hours, and didn't hold, like what happens to the organism that's growing when they don't get certain things. And that's part of the cultural story that we just kind of, we're looking at trauma like we're going to fix it like everything else. Just give me the tools and I'll be anti-racist, I'll be anti-trauma, I'll be anti-this. But it's actually a lack of something. And I call that nourishment. There's a lack of capacity in the system. And that's very early learning. So going to the vulnerability of that child who's crying. If someone's telling you as a young kid to control yourself in some way, what are your strategies? Your strategies is usually muscle tension. And if you're really scared because you're being threatened or shamed, then you're going to, it's actually talked about years ago in Wilhelm Reich's work. So as you asked about emotion, SOAS is about the fear responses. That is what it is. It's about primal responses of fear and safety, and it's not one or the other. Fear is an important feeling. We want to have that feeling of fear. We want to know this is not okay. I got to get out of here. Versus I can't read the situation at all, and I'm disoriented, and I think the ceiling's falling, but I'm looking at it, and I'm like there's no connection there. So it's not about getting rid of those feelings. It's about how am I with them, and what are my resources, and how do I land in that ability to notice the subtle things that show up that are really based on my very early developmental phases. And so this idea of what happens to SOAS is that unconsciously when we're terrified or scared or feeling like I don't belong or I need to behave or whatever it is that your breath, you hold your breath, right? There's a certain response. And that's diaphragm. But behind that is psoas. And when we kind of use our will, okay, I'm going to stop crying. I can do this. I can show that I am not going to be, I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to be, soft. I'm not going to be whatever. Or I'm going to be the good girl. Or I'm going to, be it the way I'm supposed to be. What we're doing with the psoas is we're kind of recruiting it as part of the breath. And then what happens over time with that holding is drying, right? Or density. But it's pushing slowly the diaphragm forward in the body. And in doing so, it blocks the amount of blood flow and the amount of oxygen. And what does that do to us is it reduces sensation, which reduces feeling. And so then we feel more in control because we're manipulating ourselves. And I would say the majority of people, when they start letting go of their upper psoas, and I do it in standing a lot, in swaying the ankle. Because if you don't have an ankle joint that can glide, if you're stiff there, you can't actually locate gravity. You're either back here or you're up here, but there's, you're back in yourself or you're forward, but there's no nuance. But when we can nuance gravity, when gravity is literally giving us rebound, giving us support, then we are actually standing in our truth. And all of that lets go, but we have our bones to support us. We stand our ground. We stand on our own 2 feet. We show up fully in who we are. We're not being manipulated. We're not trying to strategize our way to safety. We just simply are. That's where trauma isn't about what happens. It's about it's not that safety is on the outside. It's safety is on the inside. So I can be in a situation that may be actually unsafe and yet show up there and have agency versus trying to make the world around me, kind of safe so that I can hide out. It starts to relate us to the world in a way that actually put our agency into action.
That's fantastic. Do you do breath work with this as well? I mean, it seems like you mentioned the diaphragm. So there's a lot of stuff on releasing the diaphragm.
Yeah, I work with sound. And one of the sounds that, because I believe breath is so primal and so millions of years old that I have no right to breath. You know what I mean? My experience with opening up tissue is that at some point, a feeling being breathed rather than breathing. So to me, breath work is often manipulation. It may be subtle manipulation, but it's still manipulation. And I'm actually more into when I experience myself being breathed, it's like I am not Liz. I'm a larger organism. I am life itself. I'm entering a flow that is so beyond anything human. So I'm dissolving into something much bigger than myself. And when people do breath work, they're still, they're getting the pistons working. They're still using a mechanistic model most of the time. And I'm not saying it doesn't have value. I'm just saying I find sound as a way to play that doesn't manipulate in any way. I'm making sound. I'm playing. And one of the sounds in Constructive Rest that I use, using a soft ball behind the diaphragm psoas area, I call it warding off the gesture. In other words, the organism, the very primal organism, is like a caterpillar. It is primal movement. Poke a caterpillar, it curls. When it's happy and kind of someday it gets bigger, it starts to show up as full, and it starts, if it's a tree caterpillar, it starts to actually elongate and arc, and you see that arcing caterpillar expression. That's both a warding off, but it's also getting full. It's getting, big. It's getting itself. So we use getting big as both a warding off or a gesture of primal gesture of fight, or even flight. We get bigger to move into flight. And we get smaller and safer as curling in, but it's also turning towards and going into nourishment. So they're not what they mean. They're gestures. They're embryological gestures of the very core of our being. When I started playing with those, I found one thing that happens when you play with things like that, it makes functional movement faster. Like you get more functional faster. When I used to just do functional movement, it seemed like you really had to do a lot. Now it's like I just do this, allow my system to just show up and go through whatever it needs to go through. And all of a sudden I'm more functional. I can locate better. I can organize better. I can, sustain myself better. So it's fascinating. But one of the ways, so warding off, it's on my website for awareness. People can go look at these primal gestures, and I videotape them. They're kind of boring because there's not a lot happening. It's subtle, and as the photographer said, there's nothing happening when you're in fetal curl. That's what I want to show. It's all internal. But I'm making a sound, and I'm playing with sound and rocking. And I do that in the warding off. So one way is to open up the upper psoas is putting yourself in constructive rest, taking an inflatable ball, deflating it, putting it behind that area so that your ribs can actually float on it, your kidneys can float on it, but you're slightly arched, but you're not really pulling yourself into an arc. You're just floating on the back ribs, or your back body is opening. So you're going back into the back body, and you hiss. And if you hiss really hard for a full long exhale, eventually your diaphragm, I found, starts to move like a jellyfish. It loses its rigidity. And as it starts to kind of float and get this kind of rhythmic movement to it, it starts to move through the torso, through the trunk of the body. And as it starts to do that, psoas and upper psoas and diaphragm start to move harmoniously together. And when you roll over and stand up, or you roll into fetal curl after that, or whatever, you spread out, or whatever you feel, you take the ball away, And I would say do it like 3, because if you want to pause, you want to actually watch your animal body show up. It starts to show up, and it's amazing. You start to move in these ways that you are in control of, but you could stop. You could make it stop, but you start to feel the restorative gestures of your own midline or your own neural cord. And when, it's like your inner caterpillar starts to wake up and come out of this kind of death stance that it's been in. And it's phenomenal. It makes, your digestion improves, your breath improves, your sleep improves, your hormones improve, So when you're looking at psoas, you're looking at simply a messenger that's telling you something's not okay here. Something's not okay. And we need to turn towards that and listen.
Okay, Liz. Well, I think we could go on a lot longer, but we've done an hour. And it's a lot of people getting bored here. They're going to go off and I suppose you would, it's just, well, what are you working on now? Just, what's your next, where are you going from this? What's your next interest?
I'm interested in why we're terrified of the animal body, that we are a mammal, that the
Have you read The Tempest recently?
Did I what?
Go back and read The Tempest, Shakespeare.
Okay. I will. Thank you.
Yeah, nature, nurture.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
so that's what Stalking Wild is about.
Caliban, he's the yeah. I suppose you wouldn't recommend, on a parting shot, you probably wouldn't recommend people doing it like a kind of schematized, structured system like Ashtanga Yoga either. Because it's a pattern. The Ashtanga Yoga is a formulaic pattern of movement, right? Like, so then people I just envisage people coming away and saying, well, we want to be free and just play with the movement and not shut down on ourselves. And now we're in a bit of a quandary about whether to do this Ashtanga Yoga, which is a linear system, which there's a designated structure of certain postures and sequence. What do you think?
I think that the it's not an either or. It's never an either or. That's what midline is about. It's not about right and wrong. I shouldn't. It's about how you inhabit your own being and what shows up for you. And it's like the person who says to me, I meditate. I'm a meditator, and I'm having psoas issues. I sit 14 hours and meditate, and I go, I think the answer is right there. It's not that anything's wrong with meditating. There's nothing wrong with doing a linear movement pattern. There's nothing wrong with following a tradition that really touches you deeply and brings something deeply profound to you. It's not there's a right and wrong. It's about following what is true for you. And for me, someone meditating 14 hours, that's not life. That's not having agency in life. That's a disconnect. But that doesn't mean meditating is wrong. Or, it's like if you want a healthy psoas, I wouldn't sit for 14 hours. I don't care if that's in an office chair or, on a zafu. It's like you're looking at rhythms of your life, times when you're focused and you're centered.
And the understanding of that there are different rhythms.
There's different rhythms.
And that we can play many different rhythms.
Yes, and each of us need different rhythms because your rhythms are going to be different than my rhythms. And, and for lots of reasons, and so it's not that everybody needs to do one thing. That's that structure. That's that mechanistic, industrialized complex where we're all going to move through the assembly line a certain way. But that's not true. And the traditions of yoga are not Western mind. So there's a lot of depth there that the Western mind has, taken, and colonized. But the traditions are actually, many of them are, Ayurvedics, it's like there's a deep relationship to land, to ground, to showing up here, to rooting where you are, to really rooting in the land that is yours, and most of us are what Martin Shaw calls scatterlings. We actually don't know where we belong. So it's always rhythm. Going back to simply rhythm is one of the ways to think of it. Is ebbs and flows, infolding and unfolding. The organism is constantly in a movement of one or the other. It's not a static structure.
Relating that to yourself and relating to the other. It also goes back to your kind of primal gestures of kind of expansion or kind of contraction.
Yeah, well, they both have deep restorative gestures. The fetal curl can be, everybody, so psoas moves you through space, meaning that if I fall out of a tree or, I'm propelled in a car, my organism will curl. It will roll into curl. So what I do when I'm working with people is I look at a person's expression. And if that's where they're going, I don't try to pull them out of that stream. I do something like hanging over a fitness ball, going into child's pose, and literally following the movement of the organism. The organism is intelligent. What is interrupting? So I follow where it's taking. If a person comes in and their ribs are splayed, in yoga, it's always, and I'm not sure it's always, but the idea is in fitness, when you're looking at yoga through the fitness lens, is to pull the ribs down and in and hold them. That is not good for your psoas. That is taking an adaptation. Why are the ribs splayed? Well, a person is boarding off. There's somehow there, whether they know it or not. I take them into maybe not a back bend, but into going into that expression more. So you're actually allowing the system, because it's a living system, to do what it knows how to do, which is restore its harmony, restore its coherence. And then we start to see where we're being nourished, but the intelligence is there because you wouldn't be here if you didn't have the resources. So the resources are actually both without you, what's holding the container of, the space of what's holding you, like the mother's womb, and the internal intelligence. And there's a conversation there. That's what somebody like Rupert Sheldrake recognized in the cell, or Bruce Lipton recognized in genetics. It's not what turns a gene on or off. It's the field, and in biology, it's like morphic field. What shapes you into human or into a elm leaf, or, what is it that makes us us?
cells are cells are cells. There is no differentiation. So what creates that differentiation is the morphic field. So you're always looking at relationship. You're always looking at kinship both within and without. And it's a breath, right? It's an inhale and exhale. It's the flow of life.
All right. Thank you. We'll leave it there. I think we could definitely talk more. But wonderful episode, and well, thanks, Liz, for your time. And I never know how to end this, but I think people will really appreciate this and let us know. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.